Greetings and welcome to episode 106 of A Plain Accounts podcast, where every week we discuss this coming Sunday's gospel lectionary reading. This week, we're switching from Mark to John. All of a sudden, we go to John. It's really strange, but we do.
And for like 5 weeks, right? 5 or 6 weeks?
I know. We've been in Mark forever, and now we go to John.
Then, boom, surprise. Keep you on your toes.
Yes. Well, let me introduce you. Tara Thomas Smith, thanks for joining with us today. Tara wrote our commentary on the website. If you go to aplainaccount.org, you'll see her commentary right there under the gospel section. Tara, thanks for joining me. Thanks for writing. It was a great commentary. If you haven't read it, check it out. But Tara, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you? What are you doing?
I am a pastor, a co-pastor actually, along with my husband in Bakersfield, California. We've been here just over 2 years now.
Nice.
I also run my own podcast in all things charity with my co-hosts, JR, Robbie, and Heather. And this is weird. This is a strange experience. So for those of you who normally listen to this podcast, it's all audio for you. But right now we record this live with video. So I'm like trying to figure out what to do with my hands because normally I can like do other stuff and drink my coffee and read whatever I'm trying to get caught up on to sound like I know what I'm talking about.
Right.
And now I can't do those things. So yes.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can. I'm drinking my coffee. We're doing it all. It's the same thing.
I'll just chill out then.
Yes. But it's great to have you. If you don't listen to In All Things Charity, you should. It's a wonderful podcast. They do great work. It's fun. I love listening to it as well. Yeah. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for writing. And it's early there. It's 12.
Yeah.
We're on opposite coasts here.
We're about 3 hours behind you guys.
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
Which is okay most of the time, except when there's like some live interesting thing going on. And yeah.
Like the World Cup.
Yeah. It's all timing that's different here.
Yeah. Well, let's jump right in. We're looking at John 6.
Yes.
21 verses in John 6. Let me read this.
Please do.
I'm going to read it from the New Revised Standard Version. 1 through 21. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up to the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon's Peter, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, got into a boat, and started across the lake to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The lake became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the lake and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." When they wanted to take him into, then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land towards which they were going. This is the written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Okay, so we got to talk about this.
Yeah, let's do. We probably should.
Yeah. There's a lot happening in these 21 verses, and John has such a great economy of language. He packs so much into so little. So, Tara, you wrote the commentary. You're the expert today. Where do we start?
Well,
this conversation,
man, I think the first place I want to start is to sort of back up and get a bird's eye view and to recognize that this is one of the very few miracles that appears in all 4 of the Gospels.
Yes, it's the only one.
Yeah, depending on how you count, like the resurrection or something like that.
Well, okay, yes. Fair enough.
Yeah. I've kind of read both ways, and so anyway, I've heard it both ways.
Yeah.
So So we've got this one event. It's honestly like not a super big deal if you really think. I mean, it's a huge thing, but it's lunch. Right? Like these people are going to get hungry again. This didn't fix anyone's problems. This wasn't anyone on the brink of starvation and they were going to die. This wasn't demons being cast out or people who were dead being raised. This is lunch. And yet this is the thing that all of the gospel writers are like, yeah, we got to tell that story. And if you look to Matthew and Mark, they're like, yeah, we got to tell that story and we got to tell it twice. And we got to figure out a way to explain what's really going on here.
Well, who doesn't like lunch?
Yeah. Well, yeah, lunch is great.
Who doesn't like lunch?
Yeah. So I guess there's something about it that's just super compelling.
Yeah. Well, okay. So then what is it? This is a sign, a miracle that appears in all the Gospels. But John has an interesting take on it, right?
Yes.
John's use of it, he uses this for a particular purpose.
Yeah, and they all do. They all do. I just happen to like what John does with it right now. I am endlessly fascinated with the way that Mark tells the story. And I love the symbology of the numbers and the way for Mark and Matthew both. And they do something really great. And if you look to Mark's structure of it and read the stories in between the two feedings of the multitudes, it yields so much. Right. And I think when Luke does it, he's really trying to make a point, and he's trying to get to Jesus' identity, and he bookends it with Herod wondering who Jesus is,
right,
and Peter declaring who Jesus is. So these are all great, and it's so good and worthwhile at the time. But John is my favorite because when John gets into it, he draws you into the story.
Yeah.
He pulls you in, and there is an emotional component to John's telling of the story that I don't think you get in the same way in the other Gospels. And so you feel, and I think that this is where preachers can really go with this, is that you feel that sense of hopelessness that Philip articulates, right? That sense of, well, what are we going to do about this?
Right.
The need is too great. There is nothing we can do. We have no resources. It would be better if everybody just fends for themselves. That's the sense there. That's what John takes us to, and he does it through great characterization and giving a vocal part to the disciples as they're struggling through it.
Right. Yeah. Which I was kind of thinking this passage, as much as preaching it, is maybe important for pastors to read and meditate on themselves. Because how often do we say in our situations, in our churches, in our parishes, oh, there's not enough.
Yeah.
We don't have enough time. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough people. Ugh, how are we going to get this done?
Yeah. Yes,
make it happen.
And John is still doing a lot theologically as well. And he's still got that emphasis on the numbers. So you see the 5, the 5, the 12, which of course is the 5 is an important number to Israel because of the Pentateuch. The 12 is an important number because of the 12 tribes of Israel. Right. So we're pointing somewhere with this story. And John doesn't lose that.
Right.
What he adds into it, I think, is this component that just compels you into the story.
Yeah. Well, and he builds it into the most fundamental narrative of Israel.
Yes. Let's do that. Yes.
The most basic narrative for Israel is wilderness.
Right.
Passover,
exile, Exodus.
Exile is fundamentally a form of wilderness. And whenever Israel finds themselves in exile later in life, they always go back to the Exodus. The wilderness experience is the most defining situation in all the life of Israel.
Right. And the question always comes up, what are we going to do?
What are we going to do? And so John says, all right, it was near Passover.
Right.
This is when this happens, which for a good Jew knows this is the festival of the Jews.
Yes.
The most Jewish festival, which is the reliving and the retelling and the reenacting of the Exodus, of wilderness.
Yes.
Never forget the wilderness.
John never says something by accident. I mean, none of them do. But like, it's not like if there's a detail there, it's just like, oh, that's an interesting little tidbit. I guess I'll add that in. I mean, there is a reason for everything that he says. And when he tells us it's near the Passover, he's cueing us into a story.
Yep.
And he's helping us to see this story against the backdrop of the Exodus story.
So why? Why does John situate the feeding of the 5,000 with the Exodus? With wilderness?
he's cueing us into who Jesus is. And he's doing that in a really clever and complicated way. And he's wanting us to start to ask some questions just as the crowds around Jesus are asking questions. So is Jesus a prophet? Well, yes, but not in the way you think. Is Jesus the Messiah? Well, yes, but not in the way you think.
Right.
Is Jesus Moses' return? Well, yeah, there's the spirit of Moses going on here. Yes, absolutely, but not in the way you think.
Right.
And so John is like drawing it, like he's like walking us right up to the edge of the cliff, leaning over and looking into it and saying, okay, it seems like this is where this is going, but now let's go in this other direction and see what's really going on here.
Right.
Does it so well by bringing Jesus's story alongside, beat for beat, the story of Moses. And yet still we're going to have a commentary, because John doesn't just show, he likes to tell too. If you go to Mark, Mark's just going to show you what's going on. If you go to John, John's going to tell you, here's what you need to know about this. So Jesus is going to review all of this stuff with his people afterwards. Right. And he's going to want to talk about it, and he's going to help them understand the difference between he and Moses and what's going on there.
Right, and the parallels to the Exodus are astounding.
Yes,
a mass of people who are hungry, and what do they get to eat? Instead of bread and quail, they get bread and fish. Right, but they eat bread and meat. And then one of the striking things for me was verse 12. He told the disciples to gather up the fragments so that nothing would be left over, which is a nod to the Exodus, where the Israelites were only allowed to gather enough for one day, and any excess would wither. Yes. So this is a way to say, hey, listen, this is the Exodus relived, retold in Second Temple Israel in Galilee.
Yes. Yeah, and if there's still any doubt left over, you just have to look at the passage immediately following this, starting with verse 16, where Jesus walks on water. I mean, it doesn't fit for any other reason unless you understand this as an Exodus story. And now we've got the crossing of the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds.
Yes, exactly. Jesus is, I mean, in Job, I think it's in Job chapter 9, it says that God walks on water. And so the oldest text in the Hebrew Bible has this revelation of who God is as the one who walks on water. And then in the Exodus story, you've got Moses putting his staff in the ground, and the people walk on the dry land. Here is this one who crosses the sea like Moses, but he goes on top of the water like Yahweh.
Yes, that's exactly right. And of course, it's always worth reminding your people that when you see water mentioned in the text, usually you can make some correlation to the idea of chaos and the terror of the unknown and the chaotic. And to talk about Jesus walking right over that and having mastery over that is highly symbolic.
Right. That is, you've got to note that. But what strikes me is that John doesn't say that.
Yeah, he doesn't have to draw it out.
He doesn't have to. But Mark, Matthew, like, they'll say there was a storm and Jesus appeared in the storm. Here, it's not as much a nature miracle as it is theophany, right?
Yeah. I even like the way he says it in verse 18. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing.
Yeah.
So it wasn't the same thing as a storm. It was chaotic, and the chaos was emerging from the sea. Right. The wind, and again, you can be thinking about the Spirit of God. God is still involved, even in the terror of the sea becoming rough. Yeah. And so it's not a dualism by any means. There's at no sense as John doesn't want us to feel like this is out of control.
Right. And I love that they're not terrified so much of the water as they are of Jesus.
Yeah, that's right.
They had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. They saw Jesus, and then they were terrified.
Yes.
They're scared of this guy on the boat.
Yeah, I think maybe John gets it right. I think maybe he gets the thing that is truly holy, terrifying.
Yeah. Well, okay, so if we're talking about verse 19, we got to go to verse 20. We got to go back to verse 15 in a little bit. We got to go back to...
we'll go back and pick that up.
Verse 14. We got to go back to that, 14 and 15. But while we're here, verse 20, it's important to note the error in translation that the NIV and the NRSV have. Jesus said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Those are important words. Do not be afraid. Those are important words in the gospel. They're important words in the Hebrew Bible. They show up when God shows up, or when these angels show up.
Yeah,
when
the divine message. Yes.
When the presence of God is there, the phrase that appears is "do not be afraid." But it's the two words beforehand that matter a lot in John. It's not "it is I," it's "ego and me." And for anybody who's taken a course on John, ego and me is John's use of the divine identity "I am." It's kind of like saying "I, the I am."
Yes.
I am the I am, and that's all that I am.
Which is difficult to translate. I get that. But shame on the translation committee. I know. You've got a tough job in front of you, but that's a pretty important miss. Also, "it is I." If you're going to try to translate it in a way that doesn't get the "I am" in there, then why are you going to go with "it is I"? That just sounds pretentious.
Say, hey, it's me.
Hey guys.
But this is the divine revelation.
Yeah.
This is Jesus claiming to be God.
Yeah.
Which is a big deal.
Yes. And John sort of sprinkles these statements carefully at these key moments to remind us what story he's telling here. This isn't just a story about neat tricks. And John is all about the signs. He wants to show us the signs. And pre-show, Danny and I were talking about John's not about miracles. He's about signs, because he does. He wants us to see these signs, but he never wants us to take these signs as the point. He never wants us to take these signs. And in fact, even here, John is going to take this opportunity for Jesus to tell the crowds, you didn't come to find me because of the signs. I mean, the signs are great, but you came to find me because you ate and had your fill. And then, of course, next week will be the opportunity to talk about Jesus as the bread of life. Honestly, if you're preaching this week in John's gospel, you really got to follow it up with next week. It's a two-parter, and they connect together. And one influences and explains the other.
So before we do the homiletical handles, before we go into how to preach it, which we've already kind of jumped into because we can't not, can we talk a little bit about verses 14 and 15? When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." They're thinking it's Moses. And then in verse 15, we see this kind of emphasis on the Davidic reign. Jesus knows, he senses, he realizes that they're about to come and take him force to make him king. And so he withdrew again. What do we do with these verses with the identity of Jesus as Moses, but then Jesus also recognizing that they want to make him king by force? Maybe, that's interesting.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. So this is the perennial issues that always come up when the identity of Jesus comes up in the Gospels. Is Jesus prophet? Is Jesus Messiah? And it's a complicated answer, right? Like it's not just a simple yes or no answer that you can give to these statements. In the sense that these people are asking it, though, the answer is a resounding no. So they want to take Jesus by force and make him king. They have a certain understanding. We understand messianic expectations and all of that. What I think that John wants to do here is to show us the difference of what's going on and the difference of what it means for Jesus to be Messiah. In the context of Jesus preparing lunch for all these people and providing what the people need. So he's sort of showing us it by degrees what we need to know to start to grasp just the very corners of what we're talking about here, because it's not easy to get to. Like it's not self-obvious what we understand when we look at Jesus. I feel I was struck by this week all over again when I was reading the story. What a complicated and unlikely story this is. There's nothing like it anywhere.
Yeah, and this might be transitioning a little bit, but this makes me think like Jesus does this miraculous thing, this wonderful thing, and then the people try to fit that thing that he does into their imagination.
Yeah. How does this reinforce what I already think? Exactly. And so it's like, oh, look at this wonderful thing that God does. This must mean that
I need to have this comfort, or they take the sign of God, and their limited imagination prevents them from recognizing the fullness of the person of Christ, which makes me wonder, and maybe this is switching over to homiletical handles, how often do we do that?
Yeah.
How often do we see the wonderful things that God does in our lives and then say, oh man, God, you fit in this little box I've made?
I was in John 21 this week preparing for an upcoming sermon I'll be preaching in a few weeks. And I was struck all over again how much the disciples continue and persist in not recognizing Jesus even after the resurrection. And I was chilled by that in a new way this week. Because in John 21, it's a new kind, we know about the road to Emmaus. We know about the lack of recognition in the garden. We see those things. But but in this one, they're out fishing and Jesus shows up and he's like, hey, you catch anything? And they kind of grumble and they do, the story. So they don't recognize him again. And of course, the fish suddenly is what makes them recognize Jesus. But all that is to say, to your point, we should never assume that we'll recognize God's activity when it's right in front of us. Right. There is nothing in Scripture that should ever give us the confidence to assume that we are by nature, because we're Christians or because we're the people of God, going to recognize the activity of God. Right. We are simply not, unless we are constantly training our eyes and tuning ourselves to see and understand the bread of life in front of us. I mean, it takes a daily discipline to do this sort of thing, and we will forget, even if we've been walking with Jesus every day up until now. Right. And I think this is what we see in John's gospel. I mean, all the gospels, really.
If the disciples don't get it.
Yeah. Yeah, what do we got?
Right.
And that's certainly here in John 6 as well. The people aren't seeing what's going on. The disciples aren't seeing what's going on. He sort of gives the opportunity for his disciples to see it and to get it before it happens. And they're not there. Although I do think that one maybe minor side point, if you were doing some kind of a sermon about discipleship, mentorship, apprenticeship, this is Jesus giving his disciples an opportunity to see and to understand before he makes it clear to them. So he is inviting them to participate in the kind of miraculous thing that he does. And again, it's not so much, I like it's lunch. Like he's inviting them to feed the people lunch and he's letting them get involved.
Yeah. Well, and again, we don't need to get into this too deeply, but there's Eucharistic elements, right? I mean,
It would be pretty hard to sermon and not close with Eucharist.
Right. You've got the bread, you've got the water, you got the you've got the bread of life showing up. This is obviously a Eucharistic. It might not have the same ritualistic emphasis of Mark or Matthew, but this is certainly Eucharistic. And what you said made me think of a conversation I had with one of my parishioners today, actually. I texted her and told her, I said, I love serving communion to your kids. I said, it's always a blessing it's always a privilege. It's so meaningful for me to administer Eucharist to your children who are 5 and 3. And she said, thanks. That means a lot. We're a little bit torn by having them participate because we're not sure that they understand it. And I said, yeah, neither do I.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
And she said, ha ha ha. True. But I think that's one of what you said. One of the beautiful things about this is that Jesus doesn't wait for the people to comprehend to give himself to them.
Yes.
They are formed. The disciples are formed by these practices, by these habits, just like we're formed by what we do in worship and by the revelation of Christ to us in the Eucharist.
Yes. Yeah, I had a similar conversation with the lady this past week as well. She was struggling with a sense of spiritual dryness. She wanted to know why she wasn't sensing God's spirit. And I talked to her about, she'd been a Christian, worked through addictions for many years, had been clean. And what's next now? What does it look like to turn to a life of discipling others, of leaning into serving? And so I asked her if she would serve communion this coming Sunday. And she said, do I know what that means? Like that was her question to me. It wasn't, what does that mean? Or tell me, or I don't understand. It was, do I know what that means? She didn't even know whether she knew or not. And I thought that was a beautiful, beautiful way to put it.
That's
this
great.
Was the story I pointed her to. This was the story I told her, was this story that awesome. Jesus invites us to serve.
Right.
Yeah.
So any other homiletical handles, any other things that we can do to bring this passage alive? I like what you did in your commentary. in emphasizing kind of the ordinariness. Is that a word?
It
the
better
ordinary nature of this act. Like they go away hungry. Like I mean, they go away filled, but they're gonna get hungry again in a couple hours.
Yeah, he's not raising somebody from the dead. He's not curing a disease. He's not casting out a demon. He's just feeding some people lunch, and yet this is the thing.
Yeah,
and I think that here's what I love about this. And here's, if I were preaching this, there's 1,000 paths you could go with it, but probably the one that I would want to start with is the thing that's just what your people are going to feel. And what they're going to feel is this sense of, oh no, there's too much to do. Oh no, the need is too great. How could we ever begin? A year's wages wouldn't be enough to do this. How can we possibly begin? There's no way we could do anything. Like, that is just that deep. I think you come to a point in your Christian walk where that is the heartfelt cry. Like, where do I even begin? You sit down in front of the addict and you think, how do I even begin to undo the years of abuse that brought you to this point? How? There's no way. What, do you understand what it would take? Like, we're talking 20 years of counseling to even start where we can have a conversation to address the educational gaps, the social skills and so what do you do? What do you do? And Jesus says, well, do it. Like, just do it. Like, the point is not to get overwhelmed by the need, even though it's overwhelming, but feed them lunch. Like, why not do that? Start there.
Well, yeah, and then I think when we find ourselves filled with that anxiety, something John says is that Jesus feeds them. Unlike the synoptics, he doesn't send the disciples to do the work.
Yeah, good point.
Jesus feeds them all in John.
Yeah, that's true. I forgot about that.
Jesus took the loaves and distributed them. So when we get so caught up about how are we going to do this work, maybe we say, Jesus, would you do this work?
Yeah. And then we get sort of that supernatural passage that comes next week where we sort of take that back up bird's eye view and see there's something different going on here than just the mundane lunch. There's something more happening. Yeah.
Maybe the last thing that I might say, one of the ways we could preach this is, if we're not a little bit scared, are we really in the presence of a crucified and resurrected Christ?
Yeah.
The disciples are terrified when Jesus shows up on the water. He's doing something that they could not expect and they could not anticipate. It's the very presence of a transcendent God in their midst.
Yes.
If God is doing something in our lives, it's probably going to be a little scary.
Yeah. And what they're scared of is the activity of God. The activity of God is terrifying. Once they get to the point where they can recognize it is this Jesus who they trust, they're able to handle their fear. They know what to do with it. But before they can recognize that this is God's activity seems alien and terrifying.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which I think there's a pastoral message in there for our people that, hey, listen, you're scared of doing what God has called you to do. Well, then you're in good company.
Yeah.
That maybe that means you need to do it.
Yeah.
If you're not a little bit scared, it might not be the voice of God.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I think that would be a really helpful word for our people. I think that's worth doing.
Anything else that you feel like we got to get in here before we close our episode today?
Man, I would just say make sure that you read this passage and the following passage. And even if you do it just 1 week, make sure that you understand how these things influence each other.
Good.
Yeah, good.
Tara, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a privilege.
Thank you. It's been fun to be on the show.
Yeah. And make sure you're checking out her commentary. She's got a very pastoral, a very homiletical essay, which is definitely worth your time. It'll ignite your imagination for how to preach this passage. Tara, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. It's been fun.
Friends, preach well. The story of a Jesus who meets the ordinary daily needs of common folk, yet is also the one who is divine, who walks on water and reveals himself to us in some terrifying ways. Grace and peace.